tobacco usage is very, very popular among adults and young people. Sometimes to understand why smoking tobacco, using tobacco, chewing tobacco is very prevalent among certain age groups, certain ethnicities and races, we must always do our homework, try to figure out what's going on. One of the stories that I read while I was looking into the history of tobacco's use and tobacco advertising, tobacco marketing, was a story of a lady named Rose. She developed lung cancer from smoking many, many cigarettes, and doing 2 years of intense treatment. She, including chemotherapy, surgery, radiation, and a painful drainage tube in her chest, she changed quickly her views on smoking cigarettes. Even to the point where she was in the hospital for an entire month because of complications. So not because of diseases, not because of anything like that, or even the treatments. It was because of the side effects. Kept her for a whole month, due to her treatment and her cures for trying to take care of the tobacco smoking. And I think it just shows us, specifically in Rose's story, that tobacco usage does have a long-term effect. That it does cut people down in their years, that people are not able to enjoy things of life, that people are not able to be with their family. So to understand where and how we got to people like Rose and their stories, we need to understand the history of it. So the very first point I want to talk about is that in the 19th and 20th century, there was a huge approval of cigarette and tobacco usage among different sectors of the life and market. So one of those points to prove that is, in doing World War I, army surgeons loved cigarettes because it did two things for the soldiers. The first thing it did was it helped with the pain and also helped calm their nerves down. So after trauma and battles, cigarettes were helping the soldiers deal with normal soldier life. In the Civil War, cigarette became more and more popular, and therefore it was taxed in 1864. On the same time, cigarette manufacturing became more popular and common. So we see in World War I, the surgeons started to use cigarettes for almost medical purposes, and we see why. It was because during the Civil War, it became very popular among troops, and it became taxed, which meant that people could now make money off of it, and not just that, the government could also create revenue, and so that's where we got to the First World War. But even though this was a newfound phase, and even though people were loving it, there were dire consequences. There were things that were happening to people that only about 40 years later, right? In the 1950s, studies were shown to link between smoking and lung cancer. So think about it. From the 1860s into the 1950s, almost a whole 100 years, it took us to finally figure out, okay, there's something going on between lung cancer and smoking. And not just that, also things related to lung cancer. From 1930 to 1990s, the lung cancer rate jumped from 4.9 to 75.6 per 100,000. So that's a very big jump. I mean, that is incredible. I know it's only 60 years, but that's a huge jump. That means that more people being exposed to it, more people in different sectors of life and market are using cigarettes. So people, it's almost, they can't escape it. But how did these things become more and more popular in the everyday lives of average Joes and Janes? See, I talked about how the military, people in the government and different sectors were being exposed to it. But now, how did that affect everyday people? How did it affect the average guy leaving his house, going to his average job in the buildings, in the downtowns, in the cities of Dallas, New York City, Los Angeles, San Diego, and even Janes, who were staying home, who were finding more freedom outside the home? Well, here's something that really was interesting. One of it was introduction of blends and curing process that allowed the inhalation of tobacco, the invention of the safety match, improvements in mass productions and transportation in cigarettes. So what's going on now is now it's hitting the market. People now are exposed to cigarette smoking, so now secondhand smoking. People now are buying it more and more often, right? Then now people are transporting to different states, and now they're selling it. Now we have different ways of taking a product and selling it in different states, and also doing it in a very efficient and fast way. One of them that's very key is women's liberation led to accept change in women's lives and social status. Cigarettes played a huge role in this movement period. As women found their freedom, as they found freedom from social construct and even the cages, I would say, of what society says that this should be, cigarettes became a defining tool to say, I'm rebelling, I am different, I'm not going to be like everyone else. So cigarettes now were not just a thing that we did among with people and we did to celebrate or maybe be social, but it was also sending a message to the greater population. Now, with all of this, what future do we have? What kind of future does the tobacco industry have right now? What kind of challenges are we facing? Well, most of the challenges for the anti-tobacco movements is that over the last few years and decades, there's been an increase in young people. Smoking among high schoolers decreased in the 1970s and 80s, which is a good thing. Yet in the 90s, there's a great increase in high schoolers. And it really, there was not much of a difference between different types of races or even between male and female. It was pretty similar, meaning that in the 90s, there's a huge spike, and even leading in 2000s, also another huge spike of people engaging in smoking. In the 60s and 90s, men and women have not decreased in smoking and using tobacco products. So essentially, those periods, and even between the 60s and 90s, but specifically in the 60s and 90s, there's a huge increase, meaning that in a few years, we'll see once again an increase in smoking. It could be in the 2010s, it could be in the 2020s, where we will see a huge spike of people engaging with cigarette smoking, chewing tobacco, all different types of things. Now back to Rose. Rose was a past, the present, and future product of the smoking tobacco culture. She was exposed to it at a young age. So she saw other people, young people, older adults using cigarettes, so she grew up around it. And yet she had to deal with the results of her life. She unfortunately passed away in January 2015. But we see that the tobacco industry was ultimately what led her to this. It wasn't exactly the cigarette smoking and tobacco, but it was the tobacco industry and the market and the tobacco use, which used tobacco use to get her to become a customer. And Rose is the result of many people who have become tobacco users and have reaped the results of their choices. Her story is one of the toughest stories to hear and listen, as you hear about her family, her grandkids that she wants to spend time with. But that's the sad reality and the tough reality that she was exposed to in her teenage years, and she, by just setting into society and just living her life, she was eventually going to be exposed to it. And she became drawn to it, and her body ultimately paid the price with it. That as the information we've gathered over the years now, it was too late for her, because she was born and she was a teenager during the time period when it was just starting to gain approval, when it was just starting to get momentum, and people were trying to figure out, okay, cigarette and lung cancer do have a connection. As we have information about this issue over time, we've come to find new ways to help people with tobacco consumption. We look to see how we can do more, and what more can we do in this area to be more efficient. Thank you.